Good morning. My name is Albert Park. I'm a professor at HKUST, Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And want to welcome you. First of all, I'm one of the co-organizers. So I want to welcome you to this year's summer school. At HKUST, we have a relatively recently established Center for Economic Policy. And one of the programs is on development economics action research. So there's a group of people here working on issues of poverty and inequality. And so we hope to be a regular partner on these summer school programs in the future. So the title of my lecture, which is going to be today and then tomorrow at the same time, is about poverty and inequality in China. And I put China in parentheses here because I hope by talking about poverty and inequality in China, my goal is to really give you a pretty good overview of a lot of the methodological and measurement issues that are related to studying issues of poverty and inequality, whether it be in China or any other part of the world. And so China is kind of the example. But everything that we talk about, especially as we look into the methodology, is going to be relevant. So I've been working on and doing research on poverty issues in China for many years. The most recent World Bank Poverty Assessment Report for China was done about a decade ago, was published in 2009. And I was the lead international consultant for that report. Some of the results I'm going to show you today about China are coming from background research that was originally part of that effort, working with the National Bureau of Statistics and the leading group for poor area development in China. So just as a broad overview, I want to talk about poverty measurement. I want to talk about the determinants of poverty. And then I want to talk about work that has been done to try to evaluate poverty programs, both in terms of targeting, but also in terms of impact. And obviously the key impact is, does a program actually reduce poverty? Does it actually reach the poor? And again, drawing from some research papers that I've done on a couple of large poverty programs in China, I want to talk about two particular approaches to poverty alleviation. One is community-based development projects, which actually are quite popular, a popular model for anti-poverty work. And also microfinance, which is also a very popular model for poverty reduction efforts by many international organizations and NGOs globally. And I want to talk about, I'm going to show you what we found in China, but think broadly about being critical about assessing the impacts of these types of programs. So if you have any questions, feel free to you can just interrupt me, actually. You can unmute yourself and yell out a question if you have it, especially if it's a clarifying question. Otherwise, I have my chat box open. You can also try to send a message by chat if you want. Okay, so just to give you some facts about poverty in China, this is from a World Bank report. I've just tabulated really what has been the change in the poverty rate in China and in the rest of the world. And of course, what's remarkable is how successful China has been in virtually eliminating absolute poverty. And this is based on World Bank analysis of Chinese data using the $1.90 a day standard based on the 2011 purchasing power parity. And in addition to China's success, it's worth noting that China's record on poverty reduction, or China's contribution to poverty reduction globally, has really been the driving force for the whole world to basically be on track to meet the Millennium Development Goals of having global poverty. And without China, the world has actually shown relatively some, but still not very much progress on poverty reduction. Now, China, those are World Bank calculations. If you look at China's calculations of poverty, this is official data. This is the official poverty counts released by the Chinese government. using different lines. So obviously the broad trend is the same, that poverty has fallen dramatically. But also worth noting here is that periodically China has shifted to a higher poverty line. And obviously, poverty measurement is extremely sensitive to whatever line you pick. And there's a whole methodology into how to pick poverty lines. You can see that in about 2001, and this was after the first kind of World Bank poverty assessment report came out, that was critical that the line was too low. China created a second line, basically called it the low income line, and reported counts of low income persons in addition to the poor. And then in 2007, they just shifted to the low income line as the poverty line. And then in 2011, they also increased the poverty line quite dramatically because poverty had become so once poverty reaches something like 30 or 40 million people in China, that's really less than 1% of the population. So I think for the purposes of designing programs to target the poor, it's really necessary for them to identify a larger group of people to help, right? And of course, people working in the poverty ministries or departments perhaps have an incentive to keep their own activity relevant, so they increase the poverty line. And actually, the new poverty line in China, announced in 2011, was actually substantially higher than the World Bank International Poverty Line. But using that new poverty line, which when it was first announced, meant that there were now, again, over 100 million poor in China. China just continued to make rapid progress, and then poverty continued to fall really rapidly, even using the new line. And of course, the punchline of this poverty story in China is that last year or earlier this year, I think at the beginning of this year, President Xi Jinping basically announced that absolute poverty had been eliminated in the country. So literally there were no poor people left. Now, of course, that's not really a very credible notion, since people will obviously fall into poverty and then back out of poverty. And so I don't think it's very credible to say there is no more poverty in China, but it's really reflects quite a massive effort by the government to reduce poverty, to the point where, under Xi in the last 5 years or so, every local government was literally required to construct a list of all the remaining poor people or poor households, and then was required to basically show over time that these households were all being lifted out of poverty to achieve the government's objective of eliminating absolute poverty. I'm not going to really talk about this most recent claim that poverty has been eliminated in China. I'm going to talk more about research covering these earlier periods and thinking about what has been the impact of different programs on poverty. Okay, let's keep going. All right, so one thing about poverty in China is that it's very much a regional phenomenon. The poverty rates, if you look at, let's just focus on the consumption poverty on the right two columns here. The poverty rates are higher in, if you look at percent who are poor, they're much higher in the western part of the country. Southwest, Northwest have poverty rates over 20%, whereas coastal and Northeast China have poverty rates less than 7%, and central China about 13%. So poverty is a much bigger problem in the western, more remote regions of the country, mostly rural. But at the same time, if you look at the right-handmost column of this table, it's still the case that about half the poor are not in the West. And this is just because the West has a relatively small share of the total population of China. So about half of the poor people are in Western China, but half of the people are in other parts, especially in central China and coastal China, which are highly populous regions. Okay, so when I was a PhD student, like you guys many years ago, my dissertation field research was done in poor counties in China. And this is a picture I took in 1992, I think, of a remote mountainous area where I was doing my field research. This is in southern Shanxi province. And it's very typical of where the poor live in China, in these mountainous regions, kind of hard to get to. The only really good land for growing crops are just these river valleys kind of etched between the mountains. But what you may realize if you come from an agricultural background is even these mountains, on these mountains, they're still growing crops. So all this green you see, much of this green is actually crops being grown on very bad land. So with very low yields, obviously. But this is very typical of, and those are dirt roads. Probably by now they're all paved with China's development. Okay, so this is poverty. And I wanted to say a few words about how we measure poverty. I could spend quite a lot more time on this topic, but I think I just want to make you aware of some of the measurement issues. And if you want to learn more about the detailed implementation, I can give you further references. Obviously, the first issue in measuring poverty is what is the indicator you are going to use for measurement. And the most common ones by economists are income of households or expenditures of households, usually measured on a per capita basis. There's other conceptions of human development, which argues that we shouldn't just look at income and expenditure, that people's education and health are really very key to people's, both their capabilities and their utility. And so they should also be part of the poverty indicators. And that's certainly a reasonable view to take, but a bit harder to implement in many cases in terms of measurement. And then how you weight these different factors between income or human capital measures is obviously fairly arbitrary. The Human Development Index has three main indicators, I think, and gives them equal weight. I would say most governments focus on the income or expenditure based measures because they're kind of, the measurement is clearer. And I think economists prefer expenditure per capita to using income per capita, just because incomes in rural settings tend to be very volatile. So they'll change from year to year with the weather or other shocks. But expenditures tend to be more stable because households are going to generally try to smooth their consumption. So it's not going to bump around as much from year to year. And usually how much people are willing to spend in a year kind of reflects their longer term income expectations or their permanent income. So expenditures are often more preferred, but many countries focus on income. And it also depends on the quality of the measurements of income and expenditure. So both often get used. China for many years has used a combination of income and expenditure measures, kind of a very, it's a bit odd actually in terms of international practice, but they use both measures in some kind of multiple criteria to decide who is poor. But they are using these quantitative measures of well-being. Now, the second issue is how do you draw the poverty line? And there is a methodology which I think was standardized by Martin Rebellion at the World Bank many years ago, which I think is the general practice. And the way it works is that you take survey data, and you really need survey data that has good information on food consumption, both food quantities and food expenditures, spending amounts. And what you do is you look at the typical food bundle of people in the poorest quintile of the population, the poorest 20%, likely from some sample survey. And you say, okay, given that this is what people who are poor tend to eat, then what is the amount of calories that they are consuming? And you need the help of nutrition experts, local nutrition experts, to really make those calculations about how much food is, how much nutrients are being consumed based on a typical food bundle. And then how much, and then the economists come in and calculate, well, to consume the typical food bundle, how much money would you need to purchase enough food so that your minimum nutritional need is met, usually measured in terms of calories per day, like 2,100 to 2,400 calories per day is very typical. And then that's basically, you can draw a food poverty line, which is how much money does a person need to get the adequate amount of nutrition given the typical food bundle of the poor in this country. And then once you have the food poverty line, which is again based on an absolute nutritional standard, then you need to also add in the amount of money that people typically need to spend for non-food expenditures, meaning, you know, clothing, housing, energy, etc. And then you just add in an additional non-food allowance. And again, this is all based on actual expenditure data for the poorest 20%. And then you come up with a total income or expenditure poverty line, which is then applied to the data. Now, a bunch of issues still arise in terms of constructing the lines using this approach. The first is, especially if you want to keep calculating progress about poverty over time, you may need to update the food bundles, and you may need to update the non-food expenditure shares from time to time if these are changing in the economy, given relative price changes or consumption changes. And then what is typically done is once you have a poverty line, you want to adjust it upward for inflation. And the adjustments for inflation could be both across time and across space. So you could make adjustments for different regions of the country, but especially if there's inflation over time, you need to increase the poverty line as well over time. And of course, there's this issue about whether you can actually collect this data, especially for the bundles that are appropriate for the poor. So in China, people have often used, the government as well as researchers have often used some kind of a provincial consumer price, rural consumer price index as the best guess. But of course, that's for all rural people. It could be that the poor people in rural areas could be consuming somewhat different bundles. So the inflation index that you're using for adjustment could be a little bit biased or noisy of the actual cost of living that the poor are facing, which you would like to focus on if possible. And then the other thing that you might note, if you're thinking hard about this kind of a methodology, is that how do you make international poverty comparisons? And obviously, if you believe in this methodology and you believe that there's country differences in food bundles and what they eat, and the non-food expenditure shares, then you might think, well, we should just do this exercise separately in each country and determine poverty in each country, and that should be it. There shouldn't be any other way to make international poverty comparisons. It should be based on like scientific poverty studies in each country, which don't require an exchange rate. But in fact, the World Bank publishes an international poverty line of, I think the most recent one is probably $2 and something, or it's moved up over time. And they use that as a way to make international comparisons. And they actually impose that dollar standard using some kind of a purchasing power exchange rate to different countries, and then evaluate, well, what percentage of people are below that line. And actually, if you think scientifically, that's going to be much less accurate, right, than allowing an independent calculation based on scientific methods within each country. But there's a feeling that there's a need to have some kind of an international benchmark standard. Otherwise, you can't really be sure about the quality of the methodology of each of the country studies, et cetera. And even now, there's going to be issues about the quality of just even the income and expenditure data in different countries. And so there is this trade-off of trying to standardize measurements globally and the desire to really honor or respect the individual country differences in the nature of consumption and the food bundles and the poverty lines. Now, I wanted to give you one anecdote to illustrate how critical these assumptions are for thinking about poverty. I was once at a conference where two different groups of researchers had calculated urban poverty rates in China over many years of the reform period. And the two groups of researchers came to exactly opposite conclusions. One group said that urban poverty is basically non-existent and continues to be non-existent in China. And the other group of researchers argued that no, urban poverty had now suddenly become an important part of overall poverty in China, whereas it was a very unimportant part at the beginning of reform, and more recent years had become more important. And the amazing thing about these two studies is that they were using the exactly same data sets. So you might ask, how could you come to a different conclusion about urban poverty? And it was all about these issues I list here about how do you update the food bundles and non-food expenditure shares. And the group that argued that urban poverty was not important was a World Bank group it was Martin Rebellion and Chen Xiaohua, who are both very famous for, basically calculating global poverty, assembling all these data sets from around the world. But they've also done quite a lot of work on China. And Martin is very adamant that, once you set the bundles and the non-food expenditure shares, that you really shouldn't keep adjusting them, that you should just use inflation to account for cost of living changes. And so that's what they did. And if you keep the food bundle and non-food expenditure shares constant over time and just adjust for inflation, you in fact see very little increase in urban poverty, maybe even a decrease. And the other group of researchers had said, oh, no, we have to keep updating the food bundles and the non-food expenditures. So they had done the exact opposite extreme. They had literally every year recalculated the food bundle based on the consumption of the poorest 20%. And they also updated the non-food expenditure shares appropriately. And if you do that separately for urban and rural, in fact, you do find that suddenly urban poverty increases. Still much less than rural poverty in China, but up to a point where it's like 7% or something like that, as opposed to, I think, using their lines at the time, more like 12% for rural, right? Okay, now which of these two researcher groups do you think is correct in this example? Any volunteers? Any thoughts about that?
I think I will say the one that keep updating the food bundles. That's sort of what I thought. Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's important to keep it updated. Yeah.
Okay, so I thought long and hard about this. I mean, there was actually confusion because both of these results were presented at the same conference held in Australia, and I thought both researchers had a point. So I think actually the truth is somewhere in the middle. And why do I say that? Because one problem of updating the bundles every year is that obviously if incomes are growing on average, then the poorest 20% are going to become richer and richer, right? And so they're going to start spending more money on more expensive calories. They're going to buy nicer foods, etc. And so the bundle actually may be reflecting their improvements in their consumption, right? Not really reflecting a change in what is really needed in that culture to get enough to eat, right? But the one thing that I thought was pretty compelling for needing to update the poverty lines was the non-food expenditure shares, because one thing we know that was happening in China over this period is the cost of housing was really increasing fast. Like real estate prices, all housing prices were going up at crazy high rates in many cities. And so by the end of the period, the share of people's expenditures that were being spent on housing and maybe even other things like electricity really was higher than before. So even if you were a poor person, you probably needed more money to spend on these non-food expenditure shares over time. So in other words, it's hard to know whether adjusting the food bundle is really reflecting a change in the real need of people to buy adequate nutrition and non-food expenditures, or if it's actually reflecting just changing consumption patterns as people get richer. And you really would like it to reflect the former and not reflect the latter. And I think the World Bank research team really just reflected, really kept the food bundle constant to avoid allowing it to be biased by just the changes in consumption patterns as people got richer. They wanted to avoid that bias, but as a result, they could not accommodate some of the real structural changes in the needed income of the poor to meet their minimum needs. And then, you know, the Australian group went to the extreme and had, you know, they were accounting for these changing needs, but they were also probably having a lot of upward bias related to, in terms of the poverty measurement, related to reflecting just the fact that people are spending more on everything, you know, as they get richer. They're buying more expensive things. Okay, so just some reflections on poverty measurement. And so you can be a bit more critical, you know, if you see studies of poverty in terms of the different assumptions they make. Now, the last measurement issue I want to discuss before going on to other topics is the poverty mapping debate. Okay, so I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with this, so I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. Well, actually, yeah, I'm going to skip this. So, yeah, so this is from our World Bank report in 2009, where, you know, we use basically a bunch of different lines using different assumptions. And we're not going to really get into it, but the overall message is the same. But again, there are different, depending on how you define poverty, you can get to slightly different poverty lines, okay, both urban and rural. So let me get to the poverty mapping debate. So there is this paper published in Econometrica by Elbers, Lanzhou, and Lanzhou. That's a couple. And Peter Lanzhou worked for the World Bank for many years. And around when this paper was published, the World Bank started pushing a methodology to try to help improve targeting efforts by the government to try to estimate poverty in small areas. And what does that mean? If you're a government and you're trying to figure out, oh, where are my poor people, right? And you really want to know really down to the village level, let's say, where are the poorest villages in the country? The problem is that it's prohibitively costly to do large enough survey of households in every place to be able to actually estimate which village, or to figure out which villages are poor. You'd have to do a really, you know, survey in every village in the country, which is, you know, very costly. And so what the bank thought you could do is, let's say you had a sample survey, not everyone in the country, but, you know, a decent sized sample of people, a representative survey of the country. You know, in China, if you had you know, the National Bureau of Statistics probably surveys 50,000 households a year for its own income and expenditure measurement. So let's say you had that sample and you did a regression about what is the determinants of income in China based on a representative, very large sample survey. Well, once you had the coefficients from that regression analysis, you could actually, if you had the same right-hand side variables, let's say in the census, right? So let's take, you had census data for every person in the country, and you knew from the regressions, how much does education increase income? How much does having more land increase income? Whatever variables that you have in the census that you also have in the survey, you can use and do the regression analysis to understand how those characteristics map to income, and then use the census data to literally predict the income of every person in the country, and then estimate in each village, you know, what is the percent poor based on the expected income. So in this first equation here, it's the log of the income of household H in community C, and you care about the poverty rate in community C, let's say it's a village, then you're gonna basically just estimate this as the expected income conditional on some variables I have, and also conditional on some regression data that I've gotten from estimate from a survey data set. And then of course, there's going to be some error, UCH, and that UCH, the second row is just saying this error will have both a community component, the eta hat, and then a household specific component, ECH. And, you know, you can probably try to characterize the nature of that idiosyncratic component, the variance of the ECH, as a function of specific variables, and include that into the specification so that you can allow the variance and the error to be a function of some of the characteristics just to improve the measurement. But basically you just follow this method and then you calculate which villages are poor in China or in whatever country you have the data for. And then the bank started to do this. In China, they did it working with National Bureau of Statistics in a few provinces. Other countries started to adopt this method. It's still being used in some places, in some contexts, but there was kind of a backlash against this method. And so I'm going to skip this and argue that, you know, talk about the criticisms in a paper by Tarazzi and Deaton in 2009. This was published also in Review of Economic Statistics or a very good journal. And they said this poverty mapping method that is being pushed is really problematic. And the two problems they said is that there are these two critical assumptions that are not really likely to hold in practice. The first they call the measurement of predictors, and this is a pure measurement issue. This is just saying that the quality of measurement of the variable X, or XH here, a household level variable, may not be measured the same in the survey and in the census. And most of the time, survey-based measures are going to be more or better measured because they have people doing the interviews, they understand the definitions. And so there's just going to be noise in the measurements or maybe even substantial error in some of the measurements if you're relying on the census data. The second assumption, which I think is probably the even bigger problem here, potential problem here, is what Tarazzi and Deaton call area homogeneity or conditional independence. And basically the idea that the relationship between the X's and the income is the same everywhere. So it's the same in the A sample, or, you know, this H of A is like the census sample, let's say, and H of R is, let's say, the survey sample. That this is problematic. I mean, it could be problematic even to relate household characteristics to poverty. It could be different in even different villages, but imposing one regression based on a subsample and assuming that these relationships hold across all the villages in China seems like, or whatever country, is potentially problematic. And to prove that in this paper, so they have a bunch of math which kind of describes in a formal way the nature and potential degree of the bias, but then the poverty determinant, what they did is they actually took this to Mexican data. And the Mexican census is really good because they actually collect income data in the census. So you actually have incomes of everyone in the country, of all the households in the country. And they said, let's just apply this method by drawing a sample of households and doing a regression, and then just following this poverty mapping exercise to predict what would the poverty rates be in different communities in Mexico. And then let's see how often the actual poverty rate, the true poverty rate, lies in the 95% confidence interval of the estimated poverty rate for that community using the poverty mapping method. And the result is what is shown here. They do this separately for several different states in Mexico. So Chiapas, Oaxaca, and Veracruz. And the way to read this table, and then they simulate this many times. So this is basically the percentage of the time, this is basically in different simulations, what percentage of the simulations is the percentage this is the percentage of communities that actually fall within the 95% confidence level of the poverty mapping method. And you can see there are a lot of cases where, there's some cases where, even less than half of the villages are within the 90%, 95% confidence level. But you can see that the error rates are much greater than the coverage rates are much less than 95%. Most of the accuracy rates are well below 95% using a 95% confidence level, right? So they're just saying this is, and they attribute this mainly to this second assumption that just these relationships between X and incomes are so different in different communities that assuming one regression really leads to huge error. So they're critical of this method. And I can see the value in both of these. I can also say that I've heard of more recent efforts to use new types of data, like mobile phone data, other activity data, to try to estimate economic activity and poverty at regional levels. And I think, maybe in a new world where there's more and more big data available, there'll be ways to estimate poverty locally in an accurate way. Poverty mapping, I think, still has some advantages. You still know which villages have characteristics that are typical of the poor, but there's obviously some limitations as well. So let me say a few words about poverty determinants and then turn to some work on impact estimates. So in poverty assessment reports done by the bank and international organizations, there'll be typically a lot of work done to create poverty profiles, just very rich description of the characteristics of the poor, because this is often the kind of results that policymakers find meaningful. But of course, you can also do more sophisticated poverty regressions to try to think about the determinants both of poverty cross-sectionally and also dynamically, and then also try to think about capturing heterogeneity in different types of poverty using kind of principal components or cluster analysis. So I'm just giving you a flavor of the types of analysis. This is, and I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. I'll give you a couple of examples. So this is a typical poverty profile with respect to education. It's very similar to the regional breakdown I gave you before. And this is looking at Chinese data, nationally representative Chinese data. And you can see that if you look at the poverty rates, just look at the World Bank line results and look at these are broken down by education groups. You can say that the poverty rate is much higher for those with less than 6 years of education and on average. So 16%, the households that have more than 12 years of education, there's really zero poverty here. So there's this very strong relationship between the percentage of people who are poor and the amount of education of people in the households. And you can also show that, over 90% of poverty are households that have average education basically less than 9 years or less than the compulsory education. And if everyone has the 9 or more years, then very few people are poor. So this just gives you a kind of a way to think about the picture of poverty with respect to schooling. Okay. And then this is a cluster analysis. So this is an exercise we did for the poverty report in China, where we had a bunch of variables for all of these households. We had the NBS household survey data, and we allowed the data to kind of tell us what are the characteristics that are kind of correlated with different groups of poor people. And we actually found that the main reasons for poverty really differed for different groups, that some of the poor are associated with kind of being located in a minority area. Some you can relate to kind of just having low productivity or having very little land or some kind of illness or low work capacity, et cetera. And so the punchline here is just that there's a lot of heterogeneity in the characteristics of the poor in China. And so if you really are thinking about policy implications, it may be hard to target all of these different types of poor using one type of a program. So for instance, a regionally targeted program may really do a bad job helping some of the poor who are poor because they lack work capacity, for instance, because you may have a lot of these people located in non-poor areas, et cetera. So the theme and title of the World Bank report was that China should move from poor areas to poor people, that the programs needed to get down to the individual level and identify different types of poor if they were going to be effective in continuing to address the remaining poverty problem in China. Okay, now what about poverty dynamics? If you're interested in this topic, I would suggest this book by a former classmate of mine, edited by Bob Balch. And it's just a combination of several studies using panel data to try to think about the determinants of poverty dynamics, or the persistence of poverty, whether if you get into poverty, you stay there, or how easy is it to escape poverty once you're there. And one motivating fact here, if you look at the Chinese data, this is again from our World Bank report, is that we had panel data for 3 years, 2001, 2003, 2004, of the same households. And what we found is that the average poverty incidence, the far right-hand side block here, was 17.8%, but only 6.9% of households were poor in all 3 years, whereas there were 31% of households in China were poor in at least 1 year, 1 or more years. So quite a lot of the poverty in China is transient poverty. In other words, it's quite a lot of this phenomenon of people moving in or out of poverty from year to year. There's so if you want to study this issue, the dynamics, one of the big problems is you need panel data. So that's an immediate data requirement, which is often hard to find, and it needs to be representative. But also there's going to be issues related to attrition of the sample, that some people will just drop out, and it could be that these tend to be poor people. So there are certain ways to deal with attrition bias, such as the use of inverse probability weights. If you can kind of study who's leaving or not the sample. There's a lot of issues of measurement error in looking at poverty dynamics, because incomes are measured with a lot of noise. And so what you see as people coming in or out of poverty could be just measurement error, right? Maybe they've never been poor, but 1 year, there was some measurement error and they looked poor in the data. And so there's really actually, to be honest, not much you can do about this problem. It may lead you to overstate the amount of transient poverty, as I just showed you, that 30% compared to 7% might be overstated. But if the measurement error is fairly random, it should still not bias too much the regressions that try to look at exit and entry into poverty. Okay, so modeling poverty dynamics, there's a lot of, whenever you try to specify a dynamic model in economics as an empirical researcher, you have to make a bunch of assumptions about what you think the nature of that dynamic process is. Because there could be lagged effects, there could be, serial correlation and a lot of measurements. And there's a bunch of econometric issues that are related to different types of specifications, which I won't have time to address, but just to give you a sense of the issues. And I wanted to point out one paper by Imai and Yo, which uses Chinese data from the China Health and Nutrition Survey, where they are looking at poverty dynamics in China. And what they do is that they look at multiple transitions. So at one point in the data, they look at who's poor and who's non-poor. And then looking at the poor people at that point, they try to look at this second transition about, of the poor people, how many people exit poverty and become non-poor? And of the non-poor people, how many people enter poverty and become poor? And then they do something that's quite sophisticated, where they try to look at the choices that these poor and non-poor households make in terms of the main agricultural activities. whether it's migration, agriculture, or non-agriculture, and then see how those choices affect the likelihood that they fall back into poverty or are able to escape poverty if they've fallen into poverty. But many papers will just look at this first transition of either exit or entry into poverty, and I want to focus on those results. So in this paper, they just have a, they have a duration model, which is really just a, it's actually basically a logit type of model that allows for duration dependence. What is duration dependence? Duration dependence is the idea that the likelihood of escaping poverty may depend on how long you have been in poverty, or the likelihood of entering poverty may be a function of the number of years that you've been out of poverty. And that's an important aspect that needs to be controlled for either with a duration type model explicitly or with just putting in this case, they're putting in just a bunch of duration dummy variables for different duration to control for the duration dependence. And the other issue, which is in terms of identification, is the correlation of observables across transitions. And the paper that I'm citing, they deal with this by nesting everything into a likelihood function and actually explicitly allowing the observables, the errors in one transition to be correlated with the errors in a future transition when they estimate these things. So the likelihood that you're poor, the error term may be correlated with then the later likelihood that you escape poverty. And there's ways to control statistically for that to reduce bias. Okay, so again, these are somewhat technical. I don't have time to go into how to deal with them, but I want to give you a flavor of the nature of the problems. But they are pretty typical of estimating many dynamic specifications. So when these authors estimate this, they come up with these results. And this just to give you a flavor, you have these regressions for exiting poverty, which is the left-hand 3 columns, and entering poverty. This is the first page of the table results. And one thing you can see is the duration dependence. So D1 to D6 are just the years that you've been in poverty, and how does that affect the likelihood that you exit poverty? And you can see it's very nonlinear. Actually, that for the first 1, 2, 3 years, the longer you're in poverty, the less likely it is that you're going to exit poverty. So it's kind of like a poverty trap. But actually, for the people in poverty for many years, there's a positive coefficient which suggests that people will eventually leave poverty. There will eventually be some kind of a mean reversion. And then for the entry into poverty, it seems more uniform that the longer you stay out of poverty, the less likely it is that you're going to fall into poverty. Now, in addition to that, you can look at the impacts of all these household characteristics on the likelihood of either exiting or entering poverty. And here the results find that larger households, younger households, less educated households are more likely to stay poor. Okay, and these are the other regressors here on using different specifications. And I'm not going to look at the coefficients. You can stare at them yourself when you have time. But the bottom line here is that in terms of predicting exit from poverty, it tends to be households with more land, people who live in villages with more outmigration. And interestingly, villages that have greater access to health insurance tend to exit poverty, whereas predictors of entry include having few assets and lacking health insurance. So I think one interesting result of this is the social insurance. The health insurance does seem to be an important predictor of both entry and exit of poverty. Okay. Let me stop here and ask if there are any questions about any of this material that I've presented. And just speak up if you have a question. No? All right. Then let me go on to the evaluation of policy programs. So I'm going to give, I spent a couple of slides just giving you a background, again, from the Chinese context, what has been the government's approach to poverty reduction. And China first established anti-poverty programs in 1986. In fact, this is the first time that the Chinese government even admitted that China had a poverty problem. Of course, being a socialist country, it's kind of embarrassing to say we have a lot of poor people, but the government's calculation was that if we show the world that we have a poverty issue, we can then ask for a lot of assistance from the World Bank and other organizations for help in reducing poverty. And so that's what they did. And they published poverty estimates for the first time. And they invited the World Bank and others to try to help them design strategies to combat poverty. They set up this super government agency to coordinate efforts. There were three main large official poverty programs. One was a food for work program. One was a subsidized loan program that was really a budgetary subsidy program to local governments. I'm sorry, the budgetary grants program was a subsidy that went through the budget system to pay for extra expenditures by poor governments in poor areas. The subsidized loan program actually went through the Agricultural Bank of China. So it was through the banking system, the state banking system. And what China did is it started these programs, and then it's had two large new campaigns. One started in 1994 called the 8-7 plan. The idea was to eliminate the remaining 80 million absolute poor within 7 years. And this is when China really started putting a lot of emphasis into national poverty work, where provincial leaders, governors themselves, and secretaries were made to feel personally responsible for meeting the government's poverty reduction targets for their provinces, and it led most local officials to put a pretty high priority on these efforts. And then we have the new century poverty reduction strategy in 2001 to 2010. And this featured a village level targeting plan, moving away from previous county level targeting, migrant training programs, subsidized loans for agro industry. And I'm going to be talking a bit more about this village investment plan, which we did a somewhat rigorous evaluation of as part of the poverty assessment work for China. And then after this, later in the last decade, under the Xi Jinping government, there's been a shift again to focusing more regionally targeted efforts on a smaller group of very high poverty regions, but then also to shift to household level targeting and listing to try to eliminate poverty. Okay, so I'm going to skip this, and I want to talk about this, the village, I'm going to talk about the village targeting program, which was started in 2001, and it targeted about 20% of all villages in China were literally designated as poor villages, official poor villages, qualifying for extra government assistance to reduce poverty. And each village designed an integrated investment plan that's supposed to have a participatory component where people get to communicate their own views about what they think the poverty funds should be used for. And then the village is supposed to design its own plan. So there was this kind of community-based development idea. And it was hoped that the government would throw quite a lot of money at these investment plans, so they would address all of the key issues simultaneously and lift these villages out of poverty. So that was the idea. And how do you pick those 20% of all villages in China? Well, they used kind of a weighted poverty index that had 8 indicators that they had data on. And notice not all of these are income indicators, but then they also allowed local governments to adjust the indicators based on local circumstances and local data availability, whatever. So in practice, it's not clear how consistent the methodology was to pick the poor villages in different parts of the country. But at the end, there's this list of 20% of all villages in China. And if you look at this list and you look at the percentage of villages that were designated as poor in different parts of the country, again, you find that the Western regions had the highest share of villages designated as poor. Northwest had 40% of its villages designated as poor, Southwest 32%, and then in the Northeast and Central is more like 20 to 25%, and the coastal areas only 8%, right? So it's still the case because the number of villages is smaller in the West, that most poor villages are actually not in Western China, although the percentage of the villages that are poor are higher in the Western part of China. Okay. Now, what we did is we had data on about a third, I think, of all of these villages, these poor villages, well, about a third of all villages in China. And then using 2001 income data from NBS, and the NBS surveys about 10 households or so in each village. And so it's fairly weak strength of this data, but nonetheless, we can evaluate the poverty rates in each village just using income, and then see how the designations correspond to the actual income rankings of the village. And so what this figure does is, for the low income group is lowest quintile, quintile 1, and then the highest income group is the highest quintile of income of villages ranked by income per capita. You can see for each of these quintiles of village per capita income, the percentage of the villages in those groups that were actually designated as poor. So in the poorest quintile, about half of the villages were poor, but that means about half of the villages were not designated as poor villages. And you can see that there's a bunch of villages, poor villages, designated poor villages were actually were in the higher quintile rankings. There's even, 8 or 9% of the richest villages seem to be designated as poor. So this doesn't look like the targeting is very good at the village level, at least based on the available income data we had for the year 2001, which was the year when these designations were being made. And then I'm going to skip this. So there's a lot of incomplete coverage and quite a lot of leakage, which means that there are actually a lot of non-poor people living in the poor villages and a bunch of poor people not living in the poor villages. And then, in an earlier paper that I wrote that was published in the Journal of Public Economics, where we assessed the targeting effectiveness of China's program, this was at the county level initially, but we then applied it to the village data for the 2001 data. You can calculate what we call a targeting count gap, a targeting income gap, and a targeting count error. And just quickly, the targeting count gap is basically the percentage of villages that were not designated as poor, but actually had incomes below the poverty line. So this is one type of error. And then it also includes the villages that were designated poor and had incomes that were above the poverty line. So if you had all of these villages together, the percentage of villages that were mistargeted is the targeting count gap. And the targeting in cap is similar, except it weights the mistargeting by the actual income distance between the poverty line and the measured income per capita. So if you make a very rich village and designate them as poor, then it will contribute more to the targeting income gap, but not affect the targeting count gap. And finally, we have something called the targeting count error, which is to say that, let's say you had a certain number of villages that you wanted to designate as poor, so 20%, right? So it's not based on a line, it's based on how many villages that what is your budget basically in terms of what percentage of villages you could target. And given that, and you just rank all of the villages by village by the poverty rates, you can determine what poverty line would be necessary to exactly target the same number of villages as poor that your budget allows. And given that designation, who would have been poor if you just stuck to this budget of total designations, then you can calculate, well, what percentage of the village that should have been designated poor if it were done exactly right are actually designated as poor, given this number budget. Then that gives you the targeting count error. And then for China, we calculated this in 2001, and we found that, the targeting count gap was about 23%. So about 23% of villages were mistargeted. Either, 9% should have been poor, but weren't, and 14% were not poor, but got designated as poor, right? And then similarly for the targeting income gap. And then the target account error is the summary measure where about 67%, there's a 67% error rate in terms of if you just took the poorest 20% of villages in China, only about a third of them actually were designated as poor. So it looks pretty bad in terms of the targeting. And we actually found that the targeting of the poor was actually worse under village targeting than under county targeting. In other words, before China had just targeted poor counties, not poor villages, and they were criticized for that because they said, oh, you know, these counties are so huge and there's a bunch of non-poor people in those counties that are getting this poverty money. And then there's a bunch of poor people in villages in other counties that are not poor that are not getting the benefits. And so the recommendation in an earlier World Bank assessment was, oh, you should target at the village level, not the county level. You'll do a much better job. But what we find is that when they actually targeted at the village level, they didn't do any better in terms of the percentage of poor covered or the leakage rates. And upon reflection on these results, you know, we kind of felt that, you know, one of the reasons is information. The quality of data in the village level is just very poor and changes a lot. It's very volatile from year to year. You know, the incomes, the poverty rates and incomes of people at the village level just really changes a lot from year to year, which is going to introduce poor targeting. And then the capacity really to keep up with the information at a very localized level. You know, it's kind of the same problem we have with this poverty mapping issue. You know, it's just very hard to accurately target at the village level. And I think that fundamental inability to target effectively, even if you wanted to, was, you know, undermining the goal of improved targeting. Okay. Now, next, how am I doing in time? Okay, so I still have 15 minutes. So I want to go through a couple of impact assessment papers I've worked on that looks at, one is the community-based development effort in China. This is published in the Journal of Public Economics. And as I said, the Chinese program, again, following kind of the suggestions of lots of international consultants and the ADB and other organizations, they said, oh, let's do community-based development where we allow the communities to decide on how the money should be spent. And it turned out at the time that we wrote this assessment that this was becoming much more popular model for development assistance. The bank was increasing projects that were community-based development projects quite substantially. And other NGOs and organizations were also kind of moving towards this model. They felt it's more participatory, more respectful of the information and autonomy of local communities. But although they became more popular, the evidence on whether they're actually more effective is quite mixed. And one issue that has come up and pointed out by some development economists like Pranav Bardhan and Dilip Mukherjee in a couple of papers is the problem of elite capture, where if you decentralize down to a village and allow the village to decide what to do, it's very possible that the governance in that village is being dominated by some elites, right? And so these elites may just capture that process and do what they want, which may not be most helpful to the poor. And so they point out that you really need to understand how local governance is working to be able to say with much confidence whether decentralization is going to improve outcomes for the poor. That's basically a simple way to say that. And that there's a lot of evidence that local governance and local heterogeneity of, you know, ethnic diversity or other things can undermine or affect both the quantity and quality of public goods, right? Okay, so the findings on the limited number of good empirical studies of community type models is pretty mixed. So let's look at what we find in China. And here we have, this study is really a quantitative evaluation of probably the world's largest ever community-based development program. And then what's also good about it is we have really good data on income and expenditure, which many of these evaluations don't have. we can also look at some governance factors to address this debate about, do the poor in these villages actually benefit? Okay, so I'm going to kind of jump to the punchline. Let me say a few words about the data. We worked with the National Bureau of Statistics, and we initially had a sample of 3,000 villages located in all of the villages in the NBS national sample in poor counties, and 1/3 of the households that they surveyed in the non-poor counties. It turns out to be a panel data set that spans the introduction of this program. So the program really started in 2001, and then we had panel data through 2004, so we can kind of look at the impacts 4 years later. And what we ended up focusing on is just the poor villages and the households in the poor villages in the data set, because one thing that we found was that the percentage of poor villages that had actually began implementing the planned investments. So this is among poor villages in our data. You can see that by 2004, only about 40% of the poor villages in our data had actually started making investments. So our design was to compare the poor villages that had started investments and compare them with the poor villages that had not yet started investments. So we avoid any selection issues related to whether you're a poor village or not. We just look at actually starting the money, getting money has an impact. And the reason why only 40% had gotten treatment is that this was a 10-year plan, and they were gonna do the investments in some villages each year, spreading over the 10-year period. So the estimator we used to look at treatment effects was a nearest neighbor, basically a matching estimator called the nearest neighbor matching estimator. It's described in this paper by Alberto Abadea and Imbens in 2006. And the only advantage, there's many different matching estimators, propensity score estimators, et cetera. This is the nearest neighbor matching estimator, which has one advantage, that it had that there were good asymptotic variance formulas to accurately calculate the standard errors of these estimates, whereas many matching estimators actually have standard error calculations which are fairly opaque and ad hoc, so they're not very scientific, to be honest. And then, but we're basically doing a difference in difference of the poor villages that got the investments and the poor villages that didn't get the investments, where we're actually also matching the treatment villages to the control villages. And there's this very good methodological paper by Smith and Todd, which points out that if you want to use matching estimators, you should avoid geographic mismatch between matched observations. In other words, if you have a treatment village, you should match it with a control village in the same region. So that's what we do. You can't match it with a village in another region, because then it's going to create error. And also, you need consistent survey questions and methods. That's not a problem here. And then that if you have difference in difference matching, then you can really do a pretty good job. And they show, comparing experimental data and these type of matching estimators, that the matching estimators come very close to the experimental estimates if you have difference in difference matching and avoid geographic mismatch, which we follow all of those suggestions, and then we adopt the method. I'm gonna avoid talking more about the method. We do some trimming. So there's some villages which doesn't look like they have very good control, villages that are comparable to them. So we just drop them from the sample. And then we look at these questions in the data. How much did, what was the treatment effect on the actual investments, and then on consumption and income, migration. And then we look at some governance factors. And just quickly to get to the results, I'm just going to go right to the impact results. So this is the main results for the effects on income and consumption. And one thing you see is that on average, we see that if we divide rich and poor households based on whether they're kind of above or below the median income in the sample, that the matching estimates suggest that richer households benefited from the program, but poorer households did not. That's basically, and it's robust to kind of which sample you look at. And also turns out that migration is reduced among the rich in villages that are treated, right? So the fact that you don't find effects on the poor households is obviously very disappointing in terms of the goals of the program. And so why didn't the poor benefit from the program? There's a few possible explanations. One is that the poor just lack the capacity to take advantage of public investments, that, you know, if you're very poorly educated, or if you're sick, your labor is sick, or there's other limitations you have, you just may not have the capacity to really increase your income when there's a public investment, or increase your consumption. The other, of course, a more cynical interpretation would be that the poor are not being listened to, and that the types of investments are not ones that actually benefit the poor, that they're being hijacked by rich interests in the village. And so the rich benefit. And so that there's this perhaps exclusion by elites. So one way to get at these governance explanations is to look at the governance variables that we have. And what we look at is two governance variables. We divide villages based on the education level of the village leaders. We hypothesize, of course, that village leaders with more education are going to be maybe more sympathetic to, they're going to be richer, and they're perhaps more sympathetic to the rich households in the village. And we also look at a general quality of village committee measure based just on the number of members of the village committee and the frequency with which the committee meets, as a rough indicator of the quality of the village governance. And what do we find? We find some interesting results. In terms of the education of village leaders, we do find a difference in difference result, where the higher, if the village leader is more educated, the rich benefit more than the poor, compared to when the village leader has low education. And so that diff and diff is very significant for consumption, so that there is the sense of elite capture. If you just look at the quality of the village committee, it seems like both rich and poor benefit more if the governance quality is better, right? So all of these, so these results support this result coming, I think, from the broader literature, that governance factors are really important for thinking about the effectiveness of decentralized community-based programs. You know, it's also not so different than some of the conclusions we have about international aid to poor countries, that the governance of the country level also matters in terms of aid effectiveness. So that's basically the findings. And I'm going to stop here and ask, are there any questions or comments about these results? So let me just say, oh, by the way, there were these pictures my colleague took, my co-author in this paper took, about villagers like voting for different projects. Although when it's not secret ballot, you wonder whether they're going to feel pressure to vote for what they think the leader wants them to vote for. And there's another voting method where they throw potatoes into baskets for the projects that they support. And then whichever basket has the most potatoes, you know, is the projects that are picked. Right. Okay. So let me just step it back. Since we're almost out of time, I'm not going to go on the last topic. I'm going to say, so more recently, I've written a paper based on a randomized control trial. So I think Scott Rozelle yesterday started talking about the economics of doing randomized control trials, which I think are, you know, and if you also look at the work of the recent Nobel Prize winners, Kramer, Duflo, and Banerjee, you know, they're all using randomized control trials to evaluate different types of interventions. And I'm just going to give it one teaser before we close today, and that is that quite a few researchers have done randomized control trials to evaluate microfinance programs in different regions around the world. And there was a very influential, I think, summary, like a special volume of American Economic Journal Applied Economics, edited by Banerjee and Duflo, where they included maybe 6 or 7 studies that used a very common intent to treat randomized control evaluation method to evaluate the income effects of microfinance programs in different countries in different parts of the world. And the robust finding was that none of these evaluations found a significant positive impact on incomes of microfinance programs. And the conclusion of the kind of introduction to this set of studies was that, you know, we should be quite skeptical about the ability of microfinance to solve the poverty problem. This, despite the fact that microfinance had become a very popular anti-poverty model for many international organizations, and they are very popular programs in many parts of the world. And so it really raised a lot of questions how to think about this experience. And of course, the very famous, actually originally an economist, Muhammad Yunus, who started the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, the most famous microfinance program in the world, he won a Nobel Prize, and partly because of the feeling that this really was helping the poor and the disempowered. So this recent conclusion somehow that, well, maybe microfinance doesn't really work is quite, introduces quite a lot of challenges to existing practice. And so the teaser here is that our study of microfinance in China, we actually do find very large effects on income and very large effects on poverty reduction in China. And so I'm going to present that at the beginning of the lecture next time, those results. And then we do kind of a meta-analysis where we try to understand why we find, partly because we think this is what referees will care about, why would we find bigger effects in China than in other countries? And why do different countries find different effects in microfinance programs? So we do kind of a meta-analysis, which I think you'll also find of some interest. Okay, so we're just about at time, so we're going to stop here, and we'll start again tomorrow at the same time. And I'm gonna probably go quickly and talk about this microfinance paper, and then I'm gonna spend most of the time next time talking about inequality issues, both in general and in China. Some issues of measurement again, but then I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about intergenerational mobility issues, which I think maybe some other people have discussed a little bit in the summer school. I don't know if Steve talked about this all, but there's been quite a lot of focus on this issue, especially in the US with the work of Rob Chetty. This American dream idea where what percentage of people actually are able to escape poverty if their parents are poor, right? So to what extent does your parents' outcome or where you grow up predict your future destiny? And is there really mobility in America? And we're going to talk about the work that looks at whether there is mobility in China, and address some of these issues about, you know, how does childhood poverty predict adult outcomes in a place like China, which is quite different, of course, than the US. How is that different for men and women, et cetera? Okay, so we'll meet again tomorrow. All right. Thank you, everybody.